Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Today's tutorial is going to be a Doctor Who mini backpack. And the coolest part about this backpack is that you can adjust the straps to wear it 3 different ways. So customizable to the limit. The 3 different styles that you can do with this are the regular backpack, a short type of handbag style, and a crossbody style. This pattern is free and you can download it from Craftsy, and I will link that down below. All of the hardware that I bought was from More Me Know, so I will leave that information down below as well. I used a woven cotton fabric, so make sure you pre-wash if you're doing the same to accommodate for shrinking. But since I'm using cotton, I really wanted that structure, which is why I chose to use batting. And I will also leave links to all the supplies I can find down below as well. Go ahead and cut out all your pattern pieces in your fabric, your lining, and your batting, and then we can go ahead and get started. I'm making a small adjustment on the front outer pocket pieces by just adding the corners back in. I saw a different tutorial that did this a little differently and I like that technique a lot better. I'm going to cut out a strip for my hardware tabs, and I'm going to cut a rectangle of 3.5 by 12 inches. I want the length to run with my directional pattern. If you're not using a directional pattern, you can cut it any way you want. And then I'm going to cut out a 7-inch by 33-inch strip going with my directional pattern. And then I'll cut this in half lengthwise again. And these are going to be my straps. The first thing I'm going to do is match up all the pieces with the batting pieces by lining them up in back of the fabric. And I'm going to sew around all the edges with a 1/8 inch seam allowance to help me keep these layers in place. So in the end, I'm dealing with 2 pieces instead of 3. Now we're going to start the assembly. So grab your 18-inch zipper and your back gusset piece. Line up your zipper with the long edge of your gusset piece with right sides together. It's okay for the pull tab to be over the edge. Then grab your lining piece, lining up that long straight edge as well on the opposite side, but your lining and your fabric will be right sides together. Pin that straight edge together, and we're going to sew this using your zipper foot. So you're going to sew along the zipper, but you don't need to be directly next to it. You just want to kind of give it just a little bit of space between your needle and the teeth of your zipper. Open up your lining and fold it toward the back. Line up your fabric and lining piece as best as you can, pulling both taut away from the zipper, and you're going to pin it at that folded edge. Then you're going to take your front gusset piece and we're going to repeat the same steps. So lay the opposite edge of your zipper right sides together with the long edge of your front gusset piece. Then take the lining and lay that right sides together with the fabric, lining up the same zipper edge, and then you can pin that together. And we'll sew this with our zipper foot in the same way. Once again, fold back your lining, pulling both pieces away from the zipper teeth as you pin it down. And then we are going to top stitch both of these folded edges down with a 1/8 inch seam allowance. You may also want to use your zipper foot for this step as well, since you'll be close to the teeth of the zipper. Next, grab your side gusset pieces and laying right sides together, you're going to line up the short edges with the rounded corner on the inside and on the same side as your front gusset piece. Then you can pin these short sides down, flip it over, and then line up the lining with right sides together with your fabric. Now that the fabric side gusset pieces are pinned down, make sure that your zipper pull tab is open to the middle. Sew these short edges with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Open up your lining and fabric piece away from the center gusset, once again pulling them taut and then pinning down that folded edge. We will also top stitch this folded edge down with the 1/8 inch seam allowance. Grab your side pocket pieces next and lay the lining and the fabric right sides together. I'm going to line one up with the side gusset, and I'm just going to measure down to the top of that fold to figure out my seam allowance. I'm going to sew these short sides with a 5/8 inch seam allowance from what I measured. Go ahead and cut off half of this seam allowance. Open these two pieces up, and you're going to iron the seam allowance down to one side. Then fold these right sides out, making sure the seam is nicely turned out, and go ahead and press them in place. Then we'll top stitch this fold with a 1/8 inch seam allowance. Line up your pockets with the side gussets with right sides face up. And you can pin these together. We're going to grab our 12 by 3.5 inch fabric piece, and we're going to fold over one side 3/8 inches and iron it down. Fold in the opposite side 1 inch and iron this down. Then you're going to fold this in half, making sure that the edges line up, and you can press this in place as well. We're going to top stitch each side with a 1/8 inch seam allowance. I'm going to grab my fabric pencil, and we're going to mark every 3 inches to give us 4 pieces in total. You can go ahead and cut these apart, and these are now our hardware tabs. Grab your back pattern piece, and on the pattern I'm going to fold it down on that placement line at the top. Line it up with your fabric piece, and then you can mark this line across the top. Grab one of your tabs and one of your D-rings, place the tab through the middle of the D-ring and fold it in half. Starting at the bottom, you're going to measure 1 inch from the bottom edge and 1 inch from the side edge, and that will be the placement of your D-ring, matching the folded edge with the top of your ruler. Go ahead and pin this down and do the same thing on the other side. For the top ones, I'm going to line up the edge of my ruler with the placement line, and I'm going to measure 1 inch from the side. And same thing, I'm going to line up the folded edge with the placement line. Pin this in place, and you can do the same thing to the other top piece. I'm going to sew these on, making sure the edge of my sewing foot is lined up right up against the hardware. Do a few back stitches to give it extra security to hold it in place. On the top two, you're going to fold the raw edges up underneath, and we're going to top stitch that folded edge down with the 1/8 inch seam allowance. We're going to cut out our handle piece next, so I'm going to cut a 3.5 by 9 inch piece going across my directional print. So we're going to start the same way that we did our hardware tabs. You're going to fold over the edge 3/8 inches and iron it down. Cut an 8 inch piece of cotton webbing, and we're going to line up one edge with the opposite edge of the handle piece. Sew this side down with the 1/4 inch seam allowance. Fold over the edge with the cotton webbing, iron this down, and then you can fold over the opposite side, lining up those folded edges. Go ahead and iron this in place. Do a 1/8 inch top stitch on both sides. Fold your back piece in half to find a center. And I decided that a 2-inch gap in between the handle sides was a good distance. So since I have a 4-inch distance, I'm going to measure up my ruler and the center seam at the 2-inch mark. And from there I can mark 1 inch from the center to line up my handles. I'm going to find my folded edge side and fold these toward each other so they are in the middle of my handle. I'm going to line up my cotton webbing edge at 3/8 inches, so you should still have a little bit of fabric hangover. Go ahead and pin these in place. Moving on to our back lining piece, I'm going to mark the edges of that rectangle for the applied pocket. I cut out an 8 by 3 inch piece of interfacing and copied the same rectangle onto it. You can line up those short edges and iron it in place. I'm going to fold the lining piece along that center line so I can kind of mark it into the fabric. And then from there, I'm going to mark the sides of the rectangle on the opposite side. Take your pocket bag piece and you're going to line up the edge with that crease that you've made. It should hang over those side lines about 3/8 inches. Then you're going to add the upper inner pocket on top, lining it up with that crease as well. Pin these pieces together, leaving a bit of space around that rectangle. We're going to sew directly on this line of the rectangle that we drew, only around the outside edge. Take some small scissors and you're going to cut along the inner lines. Make sure when you go to cut the corners, don't cut past the thread. Take only the pocket pieces and tuck them into that space that we've cut. From here, you're just going to fold out those edges so that they're nice and neat, and then we can press them in place. Take your 10-inch zipper with right side face up and lay it underneath the lining piece. Center the teeth as best as you can in the middle of that rectangle. Go ahead and start pinning it down. Once most of it's in place, you're going to pull the zipper tab into the middle before pinning the rest of it down. You're going to do a top stitch of a 1/8 inch seam allowance all around the rectangle. Fold up the bottom edge of your pocket bag, and I'm going to line up the corners of that curve with the top of the zipper. Tuck back your lining piece so that it's out of the way, and pin across the pocket piece. Sew this with a 3/8 inch seam allowance from the zipper. Make sure your lining is still tucked out of the way, and then cut off the excess fabric. Going to the sides of the pocket, tuck the lining out of the way again, and you're going to pin the sides together. Sew them both with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then you can go ahead and cut off the excess zipper. Grab a small piece of scrap fabric, and I'm going to cut a strip 1.25 inches. And then I'm going to cut 2 pieces of 1.25 inches. Grab your other 10-inch zipper and take these little pieces and fold them in half. And with the fold on the inside, Pin them onto your zipper, making sure that the zipper tab is pulled toward the middle. And those inside folded edges should be 9 inches away from each other. Top stitch the folded side at a 1/8 inch seam allowance. Taking your front outer pocket bottom, take your zipper and place them right sides together, lining up the edge of those tabs with the edge of your pocket piece. Then, like before, take your lining and line it up the same way and then pin down that edge. Sew these together using your zipper foot. Open them up and fold them back like before, making sure to pull them taut away from the zipper and pin it down. Then take your front outer pocket top and we're going to do the same thing, and this time you want to check to make sure your pattern is going the same direction if you're using a directional print. Add the lining and pin this together with the zipper, and then you can sew this down too. Once you have both sides opened up and pinned down, make sure your zipper opens correctly. And then do your 1/8 inch top stitch on both sides. Now that this is a whole piece, I'm going to do a 1/8 inch seam allowance around all 4 edges to hold them all in place. Cut off any excess zipper on each side. And cut as much of the metal teeth off as you can on the outside of that seam allowance. Going to the corners, fold them over with right sides together and measure 1 inch from the point and place a pin. Once you have all 4 sides pinned, go ahead and sew these down. Turn in the corners so your pocket pops out, and we can put this aside for a minute. Grab your front pattern piece and once again fold along the 3 pocket placement lines. Line it up with your front pattern piece and mark the 3 lines with your fabric pencil, as well as the center. Grab the pocket we just made and mark the center on the top and bottom as well. We're going to start folding over the edge of our pocket 1/4 inches all the way around and pinning this in place. It might be a little tricky around those corners, especially if you're using batting like I am, but it should give in if you play with it for a little bit. Then we're going to lay the pocket onto our front pattern piece, and you're going to line up the edges with the lines that you've marked as well as your centers. I'm just using the same pins I used to fold over to pin both pieces together. This part definitely sucked so bad and is probably the most frustrating part of the whole pattern. So really just take your time. If you have to pin down a section and sew it at a time, that's what I did, and I eventually got it all lined up and laying correctly. So what you're watching is the power of editing. It really wasn't this easy. Once you have the pocket pinned in place, we're gonna do a top stitch at a 1/8 inch seam allowance. Go over the zipper points a few times for extra reinforcement. Take your back piece and your back lining and lay them wrong sides together. Line them up and pin them together. We're going to sew the edge with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Make sure to backstitch at the handle seams for added security. We're also going to do the same thing with our front piece and front lining, and the bottom piece and bottom lining. I also forgot to sew the bottom of the back, so do that as well with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Grab your gusset piece and we're going to mark the centers on the top and bottom. We're going to lay the back piece right sides together with the back gusset piece, matching the centers first. Pin that together and then you can evenly pin down the sides. Then take your front piece and do the same thing to the opposite side, matching your centers first and then the sides. Sew these two edges together with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Cut down this seam allowance to about 1/4 inches. We want to eliminate as much of the bulk as we can. Grab the bias tape. If you buy it from a package, you can see that one side has a shorter edge than the other. The shorter edge is the top that you want to see when you're sewing. We're going to start at the bottom edge of that seam allowance and you're going to tuck the seam allowance right in the middle of the bias tape. And we're going to pin this down. Bias tape is very flexible, so take your time maneuvering it around so that it lays nice and neat over that raw edge seam allowance. Do this all the way to the other edge, making sure to leave about 1 inch of extra bias tape at the ends. Do the same thing to the other side. Sew these on at a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Open up the zipper on the top of your bag. And then we can attach the bottom, lining up the centers first and then evenly pinning down the edges. And once again, you're going to play with the corners a little bit and they should eventually line out correctly with the bottom. Sew these edges together with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Once again, cut it off the excess seam to 1/4 inches. And also once again adding your bias tape over the seam allowance and sewing it on at 3/8 inches. At this point we're done with the inside and you can turn your backpack inside out. The last thing we have to do is these straps. And we're doing this the same exact way we did the handle, taking our 33 inch strips. If you're using a directional print, make sure the print on both straps are going the same direction. Cut two 30.5 inch pieces of cotton webbing. And line these up with the opposite edge, leaving 1.5 inches of fabric on each end. Then you can pin it down and sew these on at 1/4 inches. Just like before, fold over the cotton webbing edge first. And then you can fold over the other side, lining up the edges and ironing it down. Reopen up the edge, leaving the 3/8 seam allowance folded over. You're going to fold the short edge over at 3/8 inches and iron this down. Then refold up your strap, making sure the edges are still nicely tucked in, and iron this in place. This will give you a nice finished edge. Do this to all 4 edges. Sew down the long sides with the 1/8 inch seam allowance. At this point, we can assemble our straps. We're going to start at the bottom of the strap. Grab one of your lobster claws with the claw on top, with the right side of your strap face up, pass the end of the strap through the hole and tuck the end underneath. Pull it through so you have about 1.5 inches tucked under, and you can pin this down. Moving to the top of the strap with your right side face up, grab one of your sliders and pass the end through the top of the buckle. Place it about halfway and then tuck the end through the bottom of the buckle. And then once again with your strap face up, add your second lobster claw with the claw on top. And then we're gonna take the end of the strap. Make sure you have the strap pulled away from your buckle, and you're gonna pass the end of the strap back through the hole it just came from, and then over and through the first hole. Hopefully you can see in the video and that makes a little more sense. And we're gonna pull the end of the strap so it's folded over about 3 inches. Then we can pin this together too. Once you've done the same thing to your other strap, we're gonna sew these ends down. I'm basically just gonna sew a tiny square with an X in the middle. There's different ways that you can do this. Maybe you wanna make the square first and then the X. It's really up to you, but you wanna make sure that you go over each line at least 3 times so it's extra secure. You can do this by sewing in a pattern or backstitching. So I picked the one where I forgot to do the other half of the X, but this is what it should kind of look like. Adjust your straps so they're both the same length. And you can attach them to your backpack. And now you have a completed bag. I'm happy with it and I love it, and I want to make like 50 more of them. Maybe I'm just gonna get started for birthdays or get started on those Christmas presents so I'm ahead of the game. But who would not love getting this? It's a decent size, and like I said, customizing it is so easy. I am actually very happy with this pattern, and it came out way better than I expected. The batting did make it a little tough, but I'm still happy that I used it to give it a lot of structure since I'm using such thin fabrics. Definitely not one for a beginner. You want to make sure you have had a little bit of practice sewing a few other things before trying to attempt this. I would definitely recommend using the next size up zipper because the 10 inches were just a bit too close to the size that you needed. The 18 was okay, but you can go up a little bit on that one as well, just to be safe because you're cutting off the ends either way. It just makes it a little easier when you have a little more of the end to cut off, so you're not trying to get right inside of the plastic or metal of the edge of the zippers. So I hope you liked this tutorial. If you did, then please subscribe if you haven't already, and make sure that you hit the little bell so you get notified when I upload. I hope that you guys come back for the next one. Thanks for watching. Bye!